Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. Born Margaret rose on the 21st of August, 1930 at Glamorous Castle in Scotland. Margaret was the younger daughter of Prince Albert, Duke of York, later King George VI, and Elizabeth, Duchess of York, later Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. Her father was the second son of King George V and Queen Mary, and her mother was the youngest daughter of Claude Beauce-Lyon, 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and Cecilia Beauce-Lyon, Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. She was the younger sister and only sibling of Queen Elizabeth II. She was the first member of the royal family in direct line of succession to be born in Scotland since the 1600s. She was delivered by Sir Henry Simson, the royal obstetrician. The Home Secretary, J.R. Clines, was present to verify the birth. At the time of her birth, Margaret was fourth in the line of succession to the British throne. Margarth was affectionately known as Margot within the royal family. Margaret's early life was spent primarily at the Yorks' residences at 145 Piccadilly, their townhouse in London, and Royal Lodge in Windsor. The Yorks were perceived by the public as an ideal family, but unfounded rumours that Margaret was deaf and mute were not completely dispelled until her first main public appearance at her uncle Prince George's wedding in 1934. Margaret was educated alongside her sister, Elizabeth, by their Scottish governess, Marion Crawford. Margaret's education was supervised by her mother. About her limited education, Margaret was resentful, especially in later years, and aimed criticism at her mother. Margaret's grandfather George V died in January 1936, and her uncle acceded to the throne as Edward VIII. Less than a year later, in December 1936, Edward abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite, whom neither the Church of England nor the Dominion governments would accept as queen. The Church did not recognize the marriage of a divorced woman with a living ex-husband as valid. Edward's abdication made Margaret's father reluctantly assume the throne, and Margaret became second in line to the throne, with the title the Princess Margaret to indicate her status as a child of the sovereign. The family moved into Buckingham Palace. Margaret was a brownie in the first Buckingham Palace Brownie Pack, formed in 1937. She was also a Girl Guide and later a Sea Ranger. She served as president of Girl Guiding UK from 1965 until her death on the 9th of February, 2002. At the outbreak of World War II, Princesses Margaret and Elizabeth were at Birkhall, on the Balmoral Castle estate, where they stayed until Christmas 1939, enduring nights so cold that drinking water in carafes by their bedside froze. They spent Christmas at Sandringham House before moving to Windsor Castle, just outside London, for much of the remainder of the war. Lord Hailsham wrote to Winston Churchill to advise the evacuation of the princesses to the greater safety of Canada, to which their mother famously replied, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king. And the king will never leave." At Windsor, the princesses staged pantomimes at Christmas in aid of the Queen's Wool Fund, which bought yarn to knit into military garments. In 1940, Margaret sat next to Elizabeth during their radio broadcast for the BBC's Children's Hour, addressing other children who had been evacuated from cities. Margaret spoke at the end by wishing all the children good night. Unlike other members of the royal family, Margaret was not expected to undertake any public or official duties during the war. She developed her skills at singing and playing the piano, often show tunes from stage musicals. Her contemporaries thought she was spoiled by her parents, especially her father, who allowed her to take liberties not usually permissible, such as being allowed to stay up to dinner at the age of 13. When Princess Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1945, Margaret became extremely jealous, lamenting, "I was born too late," as she was too young to join herself. At the end of the war in 1945, Margaret appeared on the balcony at Buckingham Palace with her family and Winston Churchill. On the 1st of February, 1947, Margaret Elizabeth and their parents embarked on a state tour of southern Africa. The 3-month-long visit was Margaret's first visit abroad. In November 1947, Margaret was a bridesmaid at the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten. In the next 3 years, Elizabeth and Philip had 2 children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, whose births moved Margaret further down the line of succession. Around the time of Princess Elizabeth's wedding, the press started to follow the social life of unconventional Margaret and her reputation for vivacity and wit. A young woman with vivid blue eyes. Margaret enjoyed socializing with high society and young aristocrats, including Sharman Douglas, the daughter of the American ambassador, Lewis Williams Douglas. A celebrated beauty known for her glamour and fashion sense, Margaret was often featured in the press at balls, parties, and nightclubs with friends who became known as the Margaret set. Anticipation of an engagement or romance between Margaret and a member of her set were often reported. During the war, the king suggested choosing palace aides who were highly qualified men from the military, instead of only aristocrats. Told that a handsome war hero had arrived, the princesses met Townsend, the new equerry, on his first day at Buckingham Palace in 1944. Elizabeth reportedly told her sister, "Bad luck, he's married." A temporary assignment of 3 months from the RAF became permanent. The king and queen were fond of Townsend. The king reportedly saw the calm and efficient war veteran as the son he never had. He may have been aware of Margaret's infatuation with the non-titled and non-wealthy. Townsend was so often near Margaret that gossip columnists overlooked him as a suitor for the princess. When their relationship began is unclear. Margaret told friends she met and fell in love with him during the 1947 South Africa tour, where they often went riding together. In 1948, international news grew that her engagement to the Marquis of Blandford would be announced on her 18th birthday. In November 1948, Margaret and Peter Townsend attended the inauguration of Queen Juliana of the Netherlands. In later life, Townsend admitted at this point there was an attraction between them, but neither of them ever acknowledged it to one another. Not long after, he discovered his wife Rosemary was involved in an extramarital affair, which ended. Townsend and his wife separated in 1951, which was noticed by the press by July. Contemporary anecdotes about their closeness then dissipated until late 1950, when friendship seems to have rekindled, coinciding with Townsend's appointment as deputy master of the household and the breakdown of his marriage. From the spring of 1951 came several testimonies of a growing romantic attraction. During a private visit to Paris in 1951, Margaret and Prince Nicholas of Yugoslavia were followed into a nightclub by a paparazzo who took photographs of them until British detectives physically removed him from the club. By the mid-1950s, although still seen at fashionable night spots and theatre premieres, the set was depleted by its members getting married. As she reached her late 20s unmarried, the press increasingly turned from predicting whom she might marry to suspecting she would remain a spinster. The press avidly discussed the world's most eligible bachelor girl and her alleged romances with more than 30 bachelors, including David Mountbatten, Michael I of Romania, Dominic Elliot, Colin Tennant, later Baron Glenconner, Prince Henry of Hesse-Kassel, and future Canadian Prime Minister John Turner. Most had titles and almost all were wealthy. Lord Blandford and Lord Dalkeith, both wealthy sons of dukes, were the likeliest potential husbands. Her family reportedly hoped that Margaret would marry Dalkeith, but, unlike him, Margaret was uninterested in the outdoors. Billy Wallace, sole heir to a £2.8 million, £93 million today, fortune and an old friend, was reportedly Margaret's favourite date during the mid-1950s. After her 21st birthday party at Balmoral in August 1951, her father underwent surgery for lung cancer, and Margaret was appointed one of the councillors of state who undertook the king's official duties while he was incapacitated. Her father died 5 months later, on the 6th of February, 1952, and her sister acceded as Elizabeth II. Margaret was grief-stricken by her father's death and was prescribed sedatives to help her sleep. She was consoled by her deeply held Christian beliefs, sometimes attending church twice daily. She re-emerged attending events with her family in April and returned to public duties and the social scene when official mourning ended in June. With the widowed Queen Mother, Margaret moved out of Buckingham Palace and into Clarence House in May 1953, while the new Queen and her family moved out of Clarence House and into Buckingham Palace. After death, Peter Townsend was appointed controller of the Queen Mother's household. The first reports that Townsend and Margaret wished to marry began in August 1952, but these remained uncommon. After the divorce was finalized in December 1952, however, rumors spread about him and Margaret, the divorce, and shared grief over the king's death in February 1952, likely helped them come together within the privacy of Clarence House, where Margaret had her own apartment. At that time Townsend proposed and Margaret accepted and informed her sister, the Queen, whose consent was required by the Royal Marriages Act 1772. He was 15 years her senior and had 2 children from his previous marriage. During the abdication crisis, the Church of England had refused to countenance the remarriage of the divorced. Queen Mary had recently died, and, after the coronation of Elizabeth II, the new queen planned to tour the Commonwealth for 6 months. She told her sister, "Under the circumstances, it isn't unreasonable for me to ask you to wait a year, and to keep the relationship secret until after the coronation." Prince Philip was reportedly the most opposed to Townsend in the royal family, while Margaret's mother and sister wanted her to be happy but could not approve of the marriage. The Queen was advised by Lascelles to post Townsend abroad, but she refused and instead transferred him from the Queen Mother's household to her own. Winston Churchill personally approved of a lovely young royal lady married to a gallant young airman. The cabinet refused to approve the marriage. Archbishop of Canterbury did not approve of Margaret marrying a divorced man. Opponents said that the marriage would threaten the monarchy as Edward VIII had. In 1952, although Margaret attended parties and debutante balls with friends, Churchill discussed the marriage at the 1953 Commonwealth Prime Ministers' Conference held with the coronation. The Statute of Westminster 1931 requires Dominion parliaments to also approve any bill of renunciation changing the line of succession. The Canadian government stated that altering the line twice in 25 years would harm the monarchy. Churchill informed the Queen that both his cabinet and Dominion prime ministers were against the marriage, and that Parliament would not approve a marriage that would be unrecognised by the Church of England unless Margaret renounced her rights to the throne. Margaret did not possess her sister's large fortune and would need the £6,000 annual civil list allowance and £15,000 additional allowance Parliament had provided for her upon a suitable marriage. She did not object to being removed from the line of succession to the throne, as Queen Elizabeth and all her children dying was unlikely, but receiving parliamentary approval for the marriage would be difficult and uncertain. Margaret was told by the Church that she would be unable to receive communion if she married a divorced man. At the age of 25, Margaret would not need the Queen's permission under the 1772 Act. She could, after notifying the Privy Council of the United Kingdom, marry in 1 year if Parliament did not prevent her. Queen Elizabeth told the couple to wait until 1955, when Margaret would be 25, avoiding the Queen having to publicly disapprove of her sister's marriage. Churchill arranged for Townsend's assignment as heir attaché at the British Embassy in Brussels, although Townsend did not accompany Margaret as planned on a tour of southern Rhodesia. He was sent on the 15th of July, 1953, before Margaret's return from Rhodesia on the 30th of July. The assignment was so sudden that the British ambassador learnt about it from a newspaper. Although Margaret and Townsend knew about his new job, they had reportedly been promised a few days together before his departure. The couple were not restricted on communicating by mail and telephone. Margaret worked with friends on charity productions of Lord and Lady Algy and the Frog, and publicly dated men such as Tennant and Wallace. In May 1953, Margaret met singer Eddie Fisher and fell out with him in 1957, but years later, the set performed the Edgar Wallace play The Frog at the Scala Theatre. It was organised by Margaret's close friend Judy Montague with Margaret as assistant director. It drew praise for raising £10,500 for charity, but criticism for incompetent performances. In January 1955, she made the first of many trips to the Caribbean, perhaps to distract, and as a reward for being apart from Townsend. The press described Margaret's 25th birthday, on the 21st of August, 1955, as the day she was free to marry, and expected an announcement about Townsend soon. More than 100 journalists waited at Balmoral when Prime Minister Anthony Eden arrived to discuss the marriage with Elizabeth and Margaret on the 1st of October, 1955. Eden described Queen Elizabeth's, that his government would oppose in Parliament Margaret retaining her royal status. Parliament might pass resolutions opposing the marriage, which the people would see as a disagreement between government and monarchy. While the government could not prevent the marriage when Margaret became a private individual after a bill of renunciation, she would no longer be a councillor of state and would lose her civil list allowance. Otherwise, taxpayers would subsidise a divorced man and his sons. The Church would consider any children from the marriage to be illegitimate. Eden recommended that, like her uncle Edward and his wife Wallis, Margaret and Townsend leave Britain for several years. On October 12, 1955, Peter Townsend returned from Brussels, hoping to resume his romance with Princess Margaret. However, no announcement of engagement was ever made, as the royal family and the government ultimately deemed their marriage unsuitable due to Townsend's divorced status. On the 31st of October, 1955, Margaret issued a statement. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others. I have reached this decision entirely alone, and in doing so I have been strengthened by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend." The written statement, signed Margaret, was the first official confirmation of the relationship. Some Britons were disbelieving or angry while others, including clergy, were proud of Margaret for choosing duty and faith. Margaret accepted one of Wallasey's many proposals to marry in 1956, but the engagement ended before an official announcement. Margaret met the photographer Antony Armstrong-Jones at a supper party in 1958. They became engaged in October 1959. Armstrong-Jones proposed to Margaret with a ruby engagement ring surrounded by diamonds in the shape of a rosebud. She reportedly accepted his proposal a day after learning from Townsend that he intended to marry a young Belgian woman, Marie-Luce Jamin, who was half his age and greatly resembled Margaret. Margaret's announcement of her engagement, on the 26th of February, 1960, surprised the press, as she had concealed the romance from reporters. On the 6th of May, 1960, Margaret marries Armstrong-Jones at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on television, and it attracted viewing figures of 300 million worldwide. 2,000 guests were invited for the wedding ceremony. Margaret's wedding dress was designed by Norman Hartnell and worn with the Poltimore tiara. She had 8 young bridesmaids, led by her niece, Princess Anne. The Duke of Edinburgh escorted the bride, and the best man was Roger Gilliatt. Archbishop of Canterbury Geoffrey Fisher conducted the marriage service. Following the ceremony, the couple made the traditional appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The honeymoon was a 6-week Caribbean cruise aboard the royal yacht Britannia. As a wedding present, Colin Tennant gave her a plot of land on his private Caribbean island, Mustique. The newlyweds moved into rooms in Kensington Palace. In 1961, Margaret's husband was created Earl of Snowdon. The couple had 2 children, both born by caesarean section at Margaret's request. David, born the 3rd of November, 1961, and Sarah, born the 1st of May, 1964. The marriage widened Margaret's social circle beyond the court and aristocracy to include show business celebrities and bohemians. At the time, it was thought to reflect the breaking down of British class barriers. The Snowdons experimented with the styles and fashions of the 1960s. Both parties in the marriage regularly engaged in extramarital relationships. Lord Snowdon had a series of affairs, including with long-term mistress, and Hills, and Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, daughter of the 3rd Marquis of Reading. Reportedly, Margaret had her first extramarital affair in 1966, with her daughter's godfather Anthony Barton, a Bordeaux wine producer. A year later she had a 1-month liaison with Robin Douglas Home, a nephew of former British Prime Minister Alec Douglas Home. Douglas Home, who suffered from depression, died by suicide 18 months after the split with Margaret. Beyond extramarital relationships, the marriage was accompanied by drugs, alcohol, and bizarre behavior by both parties. By the early 1970s, the couple had drifted apart. In September 1973, Colin Tennant introduced Margaret to Roddy Llewellyn. Llewellyn was 17 years her junior. In 1974, she invited him as a guest to Les Jolies Eaux, the holiday home she had built on Mustique. It was the first of several visits. Margaret described their relationship as a loving friendship. Once, when Llewellyn left on an impulsive trip to Turkey, Margaret became emotionally distraught and took an overdose of sleeping tablets. The press portrayed Margaret as a predatory older woman and Llewellyn as her toyboy lover. On the 19th of March, 1976, Margaret and Snowdon publicly acknowledged that their marriage had irretrievably broken down and that they had decided to separate. On the 24th of May, 1978, the decree nisi for the couple's divorce was granted. In the same month, Margaret was taken ill and diagnosed as suffering from gastroenteritis and alcoholic hepatitis, although Warwick denied that she was ever an alcoholic. On the 11th of July, 1978, the divorce was finalized. Allegedly, Margaret did not want a divorce. She tried to make her marriage succeed, but there were too many challenges. Devastated by the divorce, Margaret never remarried. Among Margaret's first official engagements was launching the ocean liner Edinburgh Castle in Belfast in 1947. Subsequently, Margaret went on multiple tours of various places as colonies of the British Commonwealth of Nations sought nationhood. Margaret represented the Crown at independence ceremonies in Jamaica in 1962 and Tuvalu and Dominica in 1978. Her visit to Tuvalu was cut short by an illness, which may have been viral pneumonia, and she was flown to Australia to recuperate. Other overseas tours included East Africa and Mauritius in 1956, the United States in 1965, Japan in 1969 and 1979, the United States and Canada in 1974, Australia in 1975, the Philippines in 1980, Swaziland in 1981, and China in 1987. In August 1979, Margaret's cousin Lord Mountbatten and members of his family were killed by a bomb planted by the Provisional Irish Republican Army. That October, while on a fundraising tour of the United States on behalf of the Royal Opera House, Margaret was seated at a dinner reception in Chicago with columnist Abra Anderson and Mayor Jane Byrne. Margaret told them that the royal family had been moved by the many letters of condolence from Ireland. The following day, Anderson's rival Irv Kupcinet published a claim that Margaret had referred to the Irish as pigs. Margaret, Anderson, and Byrne all issued immediate denials, but the damage was already done. The rest of the tour drew demonstrations, and Margaret's security was doubled in the face of physical threats. Margaret's main interests were welfare charities, music, and ballet. She was president of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, the Royal Scottish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, Children First, and Invalid Children's Aid Nationwide, also called ICAN. She was also Grand President of the St. John Ambulance Brigade. Margaret was president or patron of numerous organizations, such as the West Indies Olympic Association, the Girl Guides, Northern Ballet Theatre, Birmingham Royal Ballet, Scottish Ballet, Tenevis Cancer Care, the Royal College of Nursing, and the London Lighthouse, an AIDS charity that has since merged with the Terence Higgins Trust. In her capacity as president of the Royal Ballet, she played a key role in launching a fund for Dame Margot Fonteyn, who was experiencing financial troubles. With the help of the Children's Royal Variety Performance, she also organized yearly fundraisers for NSPCC. At some points Margaret was criticized for not being as active as other members of the royal family. Margaret's later life was marred by illness and disability. She began smoking cigarettes in her late teens and had continued to smoke heavily for many years thereafter. In the 1970s, she suffered a nervous breakdown and was treated for depression by a psychiatrist from the Priory Clinic. Later on, she suffered from migraines, laryngitis, and bronchitis. In January 1980, she was operated on at the London Clinic to remove a benign skin lesion. On the 5th of January, 1985, she had part of her left lung removed. The operation drew parallels with that of her father 34 years earlier. She quit smoking in 1991 or January 1993, although servants still claimed they smelt cigarette smoke in her apartment, and she continued to drink heavily. In January 1993, Margaret was admitted to hospital for pneumonia. She experienced a mild stroke on the 23rd of February, 1998 at her holiday home in Mustique. Early the following year, she suffered severe scalds to her feet in a bathroom accident, which affected her mobility in that she required support when walking and sometimes used a wheelchair. She was hospitalized on the 10th of January, 2001, due to loss of appetite and swallowing problems after a further stroke. By March 2001, strokes had left her with partial vision and paralysis on the left side. Margaret's last public appearances were at the 101st birthday celebrations of her mother in August 2001. And the 100th birthday celebration of her aunt Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, that December. Margaret died in her sleep at King Edward VIII Teachers' Hospital, London, at 6:30 Greenwich Mean Time on the 9th of February, 2002, aged 71, 3 days after the 50th anniversary of her father's death. She was 11th in line to the throne at the time of her death. The previous day, she had suffered another stroke that was followed by cardiac problems. Prince Charles paid tribute to his aunt in a television broadcast. UK politicians and foreign leaders sent their condolences as well. Following her death, private memorial services were held at St Mary Magdalene Church and Glamis Castle. Margaret's coffin, draped in her personal standard, was taken from Kensington Palace to St James's Palace before her funeral. Her funeral was held on the 15th of February, 2002, the 50th anniversary of her father's funeral. In line with her wishes, the ceremony was a private service at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, for family and friends. Unlike most other members of the royal family, she was cremated at Slough Crematorium. Her lady-in-waiting, Lady Glenconner, stated that Margaret found the royal burial ground at Frogmore very gloomy and would have wanted to be where her father was buried. Margaret's ashes were temporarily placed in the royal vault of St George's Chapel. The Queen Mother died 7 weeks after Margaret, and Margaret's ashes were moved to the King George VI Memorial Chapel in St George's following her mother's funeral. A state memorial service was held at Westminster Abbey on the 19th of April, 2002. Another memorial service to mark the 10th anniversary of their deaths was held on the 30th of March, 2012 at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, which was attended by Queen Elizabeth II and other members of the royal family.